Welcome to Elijah's Fire. Today I would like to speak about prayer and St. John of the Cross, and specifically the dark night of the senses. St. John of the Cross was a 16th century Spanish mystic and reformer. He worked with St. Teresa of Avila for the reform of the church and of the Carmelite order. He's a doctor of the church and he's the patron saint of contemplatives, mystics and poets, because he was also one of Spain's greatest poets. St. John of the Cross, therefore, is an expert in spirituality and in prayer and in our search for God. For him, the goal of the spiritual life was union with God in pure faith and in pure love. Now, it's important to understand that St. John of the Cross was speaking to beginners, but he was speaking to a particular kind of beginner. He wasn't speaking to people who don't practice their faith. No, a beginner for St. John of the Cross is someone who has seriously begun to practice his faith, receives the sacraments, goes to church, obeys the commandments, practices meditation, fasting, etc., etc. But they practice these things because they receive a certain spiritual sweetness from them. For example, they go to their prayer, they practice their prayer because they like the feelings that comes from their prayer. They like the enjoyment that comes from practicing a certain amount of fasting and vigils and so on and so forth. St. John of the Cross says what happens is that they develop a spiritual sweet tooth. In other words, they practice these things because of the good feelings or good consolations that they get from them. He says that they seek themselves through seeking God instead of seeking God through themselves. They seek themselves through God instead of seeking God through themselves. In other words, they're seeking the good feelings that they get from doing these spiritual practices. Now, this is important for beginners. Beginners need this. It's the honeymoon period of the spiritual life. It's like God gives us a spiritual lollipop to begin with, but eventually he wants to wean us from this lollipop. Eventually he will take this lollipop away so that we experience a certain amount of dryness, of darkness, of emptiness. This is the desert experience, but it's an absolutely necessary experience. This is what John calls the dark night, and it's the dark night that leads us to union with God. In his famous poem called The Dark Night, he writes, "One dark night, fired with love's urgent longings, I went out unseen, my house being now all stilled. One dark night, fired with love's urgent longings, I went out unseen, my house being now all stilled." Now he divides the dark night into two nights, the dark night of the senses and the dark night of the spirit. And today I want to just talk a little bit about the dark night of the senses. What John says is that we have to free ourselves from all voluntary and habitual practices that stand in the way of our relationship with God. Things like the love of money, reputation, honor, pleasures, power, prestige, our looks. We have to rid ourselves of all the other lovers that we have so that we are left only with the pure love of God. He's not saying these things, unless they're overtly sinful, he's not saying these things are bad in themselves. Money is not bad in itself, but it's what he calls the inordinate desire for money that causes the problem. Inordinate is an unreasonable, excessive desire for money. So you can be a poor person and still have an inordinate desire for money. You can be a rich person but not be attached to your wealth. It's this attachment, it's this desire that John is attacking, not so much the thing in itself. It's like Jesus says to us, if anybody wants to be a follower of mine, he must take up his cross, deny himself, and follow him. This is what John is talking about. This certain stripping, this certain taking away in order that we can possess and love God for himself and for himself alone. So in both St. John of the Cross and in Teresa of Avila, the spiritual life is built on the moral life and on the ascetical life. We see this also in the Fathers of the Desert. As St. Teresa says, you cannot have a prayer life, or she says prayer and self-indulgence do not go together. So prayer and self-denial go together. And the purpose of this self-denial, the purpose of this taking away, the purpose of this stripping, the purpose of this dying, if we want to use the language of Jesus, is that we can be united to Christ through faith and love. As St. John writes in his poem, about the dark night. He says, the dark night unites the lover with the beloved, transforming the beloved in her lover. The dark night unites the lover with the beloved, transforming the beloved in her lover. So we want to achieve union with God, and it's the dark night, it's through the dark night that we achieve this union. Thank you for listening. God bless.